David Vizard here. Many of you will know that name from the many books I've written on high performance engines. I think some 35 so far. Some of you will also know me from attending my how to build horsepower seminars. Details on that available at www.davidvizardperformanceseminars.com. Today I'm here to show you a new and innovative flow bench program. This is a program written for cylinder head porters by cylinder head porters, and you'll see the relevance of that as we go through a description of the program. Here's the opening page to the IOP program here. What we're going to do is just hit enter, and this brings us up with this page of results. Now we don't have anything to enter into this as yet, so we're going to bring up flow test 1. What I'm going to do now is load some data from a head we previously tested. Here's the file that we need, so I am going to click on that and open it. Now that is the records we've got there. When we use this file, we enter our flow numbers in these columns here, the two red ones, and it automatically corrects them in here. As it happens, when this test was done, there was no correction. The correction is 1. Now, what we can do now is we can analyze these results. But first, we need to make some relevant inputs so the computer knows how to calculate what's going on. Now, this is very important because this is data which is going to help you, the porter, decide where next to go. We'll see how that works in a moment. What we have here is the data that we need to input. First off, the head that we're testing is an import copy of the Vortec Chevy head, so we've entered that there. The first thing we do is enter the port volume. For that, we actually physically measure the port, pour it, and see how many cc's it contains. And it's not always what the brochures or the data that you have out there shows. In our case, it's 162 cc's, right? The intake valve on this is a 202, and we're going to use a 1.6 exhaust, so we put that data in. That is actually a bigger size than the head normally comes with. It normally is with a 194-15 valve, but we've machined it for a 202. Stem diameter, throat diameter, everything that's in a white box with red letters we enter. The intake centerline length. Right, now the intake centerline length, we measure that with a piece of solder. We'll measure the long side and the short side, bending the solder to the form of the port, and then average the two numbers, and that's what we put in there. We do the same on the exhaust. Also, we enter all this data here and the data over there, so it will calculate whatever area that we need to ascertain, maybe the peak velocity area, because it may be this the minimum cross-sectional area. Right, we're going to test at 28, we add all that in. Then we do the flow tests, put the numbers in here and here, and it calculates these numbers here, plus a whole load of data across here, such as the CFM per square inch of intake and exhaust, the discharge coefficient, etc., mean port velocity of the intake and exhaust, and the flow ratio. With that, we can save the data and then save data, save, yes, okay. Now we can go and look at some graphs of that data. Right, I'm going to check this out here. Quit. Compare two flow tests. We're going to make a comparison of 1 and 1 at the moment because we don't have the second one as yet. Graph. There's the CFM of our cylinder head there. This is the sort of data that every program gets, but this is where we're going to find a difference. Okay, let's just have a look and see what we've got here. This is the CFM per square inch of intake valve and exhaust valve. What we see here is how much flow there is per square inch. Now this is a very telling curve if you know what you're looking for. For instance, this is another way of looking at the percentage efficiency of the valve. 145, 46 CFM up here is about 100% efficient. Our exhaust valve here is at 89% efficient, as we could get from the data on the chart. But you'll see it drops very quickly down to in the mid-50s here. This red line here is the 0.25 lift point of the valve. That is, for a 1.6 exhaust valve, 0.25D or a quarter D will be 400 thousandths lift. You'll notice that there's a change in the slope here very much. This is what I call the inflection point, right? When a valve reaches 0.25D, the flow area around the valve equals the area of the valve. So technically we can't get any more breathing area than that past 0.25D. But the flow pattern changes on a 2-valve engine with vertical valves like a small block Chevy or Ford, and to a slightly lesser extent a big block Chevy. The flow changes from trying to flow around the valve to windowing out towards the center, right? It has a bigger area available to it as a window forms towards the middle of the cylinder. If we've got enough bias on our port, that is, we've lent the port over enough in the direction of the center of the cylinder, this inflection point, instead of more or less leveling out, will start to climb again, back up here. A good Pro stock engine will have this, well, it'll be further up here, but it'll have this point climb right back up again. So the efficiency of the valve actually becomes higher than you'd expect from a 4-valve per cylinder engine. We can see the same thing happening here on the intake. You see it levels out, doesn't do anything, right? The inflection, past the inflection point, the port is virtually topped out, saturated. However, this is telling us we don't have enough bias on the port. This is what I mean by saying this is a porting program written by porters for porters, right? No other program out there will give you this kind of data. It'll expect you to already know what's going on, and it's not going to help your porting skills like this program. Okay, we're now going to look at the next aspect that this program will tell you. If you've filled in all the data in detail on the original screen, you'll be able to also check the velocity that exists in the port. So we check out the velocity there, we calculate there, we hit graph, and there's the velocity in the port. Now this is an interesting graph here. Many people talk about port velocity and how important it is, but they never actually tell you what it is you want. I'm sure you can ask Pro stock head porters, etc., etc. I don't care who it is, but no one gives you a concrete number. We've got some numbers here now. Look at this curve here. It's topping out at about 200 and I guess it's about 260. Exhaust at something less, so 250 maybe. That's not high enough. This port is not efficient enough to get up a good port velocity, and port velocity is what we need if we're going to make good torque below peak power, and all the way down to the lowest RPM that we're going to pull the engine to. Right, so we can see that the port velocity is not that good. Now, we can go one more step with this, and that's what we're going to do next. The next thing we're going to deal with is something that very, very few head porters have any knowledge of. Probably the only ones to have any prior knowledge before seeing this program are those attendees to my how to build horsepower class. And during this class I go through what we're now going to deal with, and that is port energy in detail. You're probably well aware that the more energy a bullet has, the more it's going to be able to penetrate whatever the target is. The target is a restriction to that bullet's motion. When we've got a port for a cylinder, the valve on its way to closing becomes a resistance to the flow of air into the cylinder. The higher the port energy is, the more ramming effect it will have during the last phases, or in fact any phase, but especially the last part of the induction stroke when the piston is actually now on the way up the bore. What we need to do here is to port our cylinder heads so that we get a balance that gives the best port energy. That balance is between mass of air and the velocity. Now, here's something that you'll see quoted very often. Heads that show good on a flow bench don't necessarily show good on the dyno. If you're using port energy to figure out whether your heads are better or not, then whatever shows good on the port energy shows good on the dyno. There are no exceptions. In other words, optimizing the port energy gives us a point at which we can say that the size of the port and the flow and the velocity are optimum, right? But we can go one stage further than that. But first, let me show you a graph of the port energy. Right, calculate graph. Right, here's our port energy. We'll expect the exhaust port to be lower because it's a smaller port. Now this graph is only any good when you compare it with where you started. But let's say we want to compare our cylinder head and see how well we've done it compared with, say, a Formula One head. Well, guess what? You probably don't have access to a Formula One head. Doesn't matter. We can actually establish how good your work is compared with a Formula One engine if a few data points are known on the F1 engine, and I can fill you in on that. So let's go to our next step, which is port energy density.